Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Paul Atherton, an ex-Wall Street advisor and finance whiz, and Tim Whiffen, a millennial with a keen interest in complex problems, talk to experts in many different fields to learn and discover the world's economic and political issues. This is Currency Affairs. I'm here today with Paul Atherton. How are you, Paul?
I'm great, Tim.
It's good to hear. Now, I've heard you say earlier that you think USA is doing quite well economically. And I must admit...
extremely well.
It seems like people are complaining that they're not doing as well as they used to. So what are your reasonings? I'd love to know, because it doesn't, on the surface, appear that anyone's exclaiming this from the hilltops. So.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think the sort of noise you hear is that the big problem the United States has at the moment is they've got a president called Donald Trump, and President Trump is doing everything wrong. And I think you hear a lot of that outside of the United States. I think in the United States you get the sort of the 50-50 split, which you do in most countries in terms of the political divide. You get one side that he's doing everything right, and on the other side he's doing everything wrong. And I think I fall in a number of those categories because I certainly see things that he's doing perfectly correct. It's absolutely correct. So, and you just got to use the data and follow the data, irrespective of what you believe on of the individual and the person. And we should be driving ourselves and understanding the world via the data, not by the way we just feel about something.
Or even the news media necessarily.
Particularly the news media. I mean, the news media is just so far off. I mean, they need to sell, as we've said before on many podcasts, Tim, right, that the aim of the news media is to sell more media, so they don't care. Facts is definitely the secondary, a third or maybe fifth, 10th, I don't know.
It's also hard to expect that journalists have large profession in economics aside from specialty productions like the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, though you know what I feel about economics.
Yeah, that's
true.
And
economists. So, my two most hated favorite groups are economists and journalists. So a journalist interviewing an economist is pretty much something that I would run away from. But, okay, so I think, Trump is doing some enormously good things. I mean, three of them just sort of jump to mind. So the first is Trump is pulling the United States back rather explicitly from the center of international trade. This is a very good thing for the United States, and it's inevitable for the rest of the world. And it's the rest of the world that's upset by this. Now, what you hear most of the time is, particularly from countries that utilize the United States the most to their advantage, they manipulate it to the most of their advantage. And there are three major countries: Germany, Japan, China. Those countries, guess what, are the least happy with what Trump is doing. They're least happy, and there's a very good reason for it. It's because they utilize the structure of the United States economy within the global economy to their advantage. And what Trump is doing is he's moving the United States out of it. I don't necessarily agree with the approach. That is, he's using tariffs and various other efforts, but there are some of his approaches which I do agree with, which is renegotiating to a degree various trade agreements, and this is nothing, no problem there. So whatever approach is happening, you will see the United States pulling itself back from the center of global trade. And what that means is the rest of the world does, China, particularly Japan, Germany, is they use the United States as the, it's often called the consumer of last resort. So the United States has the deepest, most flexible capital accounts, which are used by those three countries and others to fill up with capital. They export money in droves in these surplus countries, send it to the United States, forces the United States into deficit, and that deficit forces consumption. Okay, so we've gone over this before by the balance of payments. A deficit forces consumption. It forces an excess of savings an excess of investment over savings. So either you're investing more in investments, putting more money in investments, or you're consuming more. And that's what the rest of the world wants to do, because Germany and Japan and China, what do? They can produce more than their countries can consume, so they need the rest of the globe to do it, and really they don't need the rest of the globe, they need the United States to do it. If the United States did not consume this, those countries I've just mentioned would be in an enormously difficult economic position. They would get sort of unemployment levels that would be incredibly difficult for them to handle. So they use the United States as that. And the United States does not benefit from this whatsoever.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
The function of producing in mass, say for instance, the example that's coming to mind for me is, let's say, Toyota cars, right? So Japan killed the car industry largely in the UK because they were exporting essentially to other countries, like you were saying, to the point where they were overproducing, that they couldn't buy their own cars. They were producing for other countries as well. Is that the right way to look at it, or is that like just a completely unique example?
The better way to look at it is these particular countries have an excess of capital. Okay, so where do they get the excess of capital? They've got a distorted economy internal to their country. That means they have a repressed household sector, and that money gets put. Where does that money? If you have a repressed household sector, that means you've got that money is being funneled to the producer sector, manufacturers like car manufacturers, laptops or whatever China makes, you know, and that then gets pushed into cheap goods, which get sent to the United States. There's surplus.
And they're cheap because they're mass produced. They're producing.
Well, they're subsidized by the household sector.
Sure.
The capital gets placed, so that's a subsidization. The excess savings goes to the United States. So effectively, the producer sector gets very, very cheap capital. But, and here's the important point, with the excess of savings in those said countries, that's got to go somewhere. So it has to go somewhere. By definition, if savings has to equal investment. If it doesn't, because you've got excess savings, it goes somewhere else, and it goes to the United States. What happens when you send excess savings to the United States? Like we discussed, if you've got excess savings going to the United States into their capital markets, the United States savings has to go down. Consumption has to go up. Well, savings has to go down in relative to investments. Now, the United States does not need Chinese money for its investment. Doesn't need German money, doesn't need Japan money. Investments are not being made in the United States for political reasons. So the money that's pouring into the US, producing that difference, creating a huge deficit, creating massive consumption, and that consumption is, guess what? Exactly what the Chinese, Germans, and Japanese want to sell. And it's just a fact, right? This is not an arguable point. This is an absolute fact. This is like gravity. You can argue about it, you're not going to be happy about it, but the fact that gravity works is just part of physics. This is accounting identities. It exists. You can follow the money, and you can see where it ends up. So anyway, the other country, by the way, that has a massive deficit is another country that has deep financial and capital markets, and that's the United Kingdom. In fact, if you want to see where the deficits are, it's always countries that have deep financial systems, a good, flexible, open financial system. Ours being one as well, Tim.
Open as in liberal?
Open as is very easy to go in, put money in.
I see.
Yeah.
So like borders, I guess. It has no economic borders.
There's no stopping it.
Yeah.
Effectively, if you want to buy a house, although I understand rules like that are changing, but if you want to buy anything in Australia, if a government wants to buy Aussie bonds, they can. If they want to put money into buying a house, they can. Any money pouring into Australia, receive with open arms, and every dollar of those is going to increase the deficit, and the deficit will increase consumption. Well, consumption over investment. So that forces debt. Okay, so that's rather complex, but let's get back to the Trump point, and that is he is removing that. Now, if Trump succeeds, which he will, this will happen, It's happening a lot quicker than I'd expected. So this is inevitable. So the United States represented, I think, at its peak, 40, maybe 50% of the global economy.
Wow.
Perhaps people can correct me on what the exact peak was. It now represents roughly 24%, give or take, of the global economy. It's so much smaller now. Naturally, the rest of the world's come along. I mean, back in the 60s or 50s, you got war-torn Europe was being rebuilt. Where was China?
It's Maoist still, right?
Yeah, right in the depths of... And Japan, where was that? I mean, so it had to be a big portion of the global economy. Those countries come along, start growing, it's just going to happen. And again, it's kind of happened at the expense of the United States. So historically, the United States being positioned like the center of the global trade was great for the United States. Well, it's great for everyone because that meant capitalism won and communism didn't. Stabilized the world order, rebuilt the post-war economies, and brought, I guess, Russia into the fold, roughly, and China eventually as well. So we've all been winners off it. The United States has not been, in the sense, in isolation, but it has been as part of the collective good. But those times are over. And as it pulls itself away, the rest of the world kind of kicks and complains.
So that would be one of the reasons that Trump is bringing America back into doing well. So
yeah.
What are the other reasons?
So one of the reasons that when I was watching Trump during the primaries and the Republican debates, and my wife is from New York, from the United States. My two boys are USA citizens, but I am not. So I just make this comment from afar and I guess take that with the significant grains of salt that it's worth. But, I see Trump as being very non-political, and I think that seems to be a controversial position. And I don't know why, because, many of the things he does are so obviously not they're not slick at all, particularly if you look at Obama and how well polished he was and how good he looked on stage and the way he presented messages. And
a real politician.
He was an incredibly good politician. And, who wants a really good politician? We've always wanted non-politicians, haven't we? And I think for many of the issues that he is espousing and talking about, a lot of them are very left-wing. Now, people might not be... Yeah.
Some of them are right-wing as well. I mean, it kind of depends. It's clear that he's not an ideologue, right? It's clear that not all of his ideas are coming from one camp.
No, it's definitely not an ideologue. So it seems to me that's a good thing. I mean, he's managed to, remove a portion of the United States political system from its central mores of being tied to left versus right. And now it seems it's, Trump or not. And Trump is, it's very difficult to say Democratic, left wing or right wing, because a lot of his positioning, as far as I can see, seem left wing. I mean, he's fighting for, one of his biggest voting class, right? We're white middle class. So he was going for a large portion of the people that are traditionally Democratic, and he is supporting them. He's one of the only people that have given them a voice. So not being political gives him a little bit of a free hand, or not a little bit, a significant free hand, and I think that's really good. I mean, what's the great thing? Because when you look at him, I think most people like him or hate him can sort of see the bruises or the scars of a guy that's been there and has done that, like the guy that's actually done something. Whereas the politician literally hasn't done anything. And they enrich themselves post their political career. Well, Trump, people seem to be very upset, again, mostly on one side of the party, that he's so wealthy, but at least he's wealthy on the way in, not on the way out. So he's going to make policies. I mean, isn't it better that he's doing things now? Right? Is it any better if he's doing for a politician to make policy to enrich themselves post presidency versus while he's doing it? I mean, I don't see the argument there. So anyway, so he's got these scars of being a real practitioner. And a politician is the last person to being a practitioner. I'm very pleased with that. And the third reason I think Trump is quite an interesting character and potentially very, very good for the United States economy is, and this is a controversial position, and I predicted this. This was one of the reasons I was more positive on Trump than many when he was first elected. My bet was that he wouldn't get much accomplished.
Yeah, because you've said that before.
Yeah, and I've got people on the left saying he's doing too much and it's bad. And I got people on the right saying he's doing a lot and it's good. And I don't see him doing much at all, except for on the occasion he's removing things.
So there was a tax break. That seems to be the biggest economic.
Yeah. So, and again, so he achieved one crowning achievement is a tax break. Now, I think this is economically very bad. This is a bad thing. It's not what the United States needs, but let's not get into that. But thank God he's only achieved one thing.
Yeah.
Like, you really don't want, as far as I can see, too many politicians achieving a lot. You don't want, we used to say in Wall Street, the only thing worse than an idiot is an enthusiastic one. And you don't want an enthusiastic politician. That can be a disaster. So what he is enthusiastic about, FYI, is removing regulations. And he has done a significant amount of that. And that causes a lot of people a lot of grief. But guess what? That really helps the economy. I mean, a lot of politicians, what do they want to do? They want to create regulations. That's called red tape.
Yeah. So and that harms the free market. So that's like, for instance, an Australian example would be that was John Howard's or Robert Menzies' approach was deregulation.
Deregulation.
And we experienced some of the best economic periods in Australia during under those governments. I mean, it's a completely different example, but
yeah. So he is removing regulation at pace. Now, if you listen to some of the hyperbole coming out, it is exaggerated, but got to give him credit. It's certainly happening, and the amount of regulations that are being in place is at the lowest level since Reagan, I believe.
Right.
In other words, they're not putting a lot out there, and we're removing quite a bit. So I think this is just awesome.
Okay.
Now, there are going to be times where this is going to go too far and there will be people upset, and there are places where you need regulation. I think this is very clear, but to the most part, less regulation is better.
Is this is purely economic talk, or
this is like, we're talking from economics?
Yeah, not from a social point of view, just to be clear.
Yeah, from a social perspective. But to the most part, you've got to realize that to the most part, regulations don't help the social good as much as you think. And clearly there are cases where it does. Right? I mean, you wouldn't want a non-regulated air traffic industry, would you?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So clearly we can't be silly about it. But over-regulation, so let's call it by definition, is not a good thing. Red tape. You can think about where it's a heavily regulated, stifled economies on the globe. They tend to be in the developing world. They tend to be politically corrupt. And it's terribly difficult to get business done. This is very good. See, most people think of the United States as a country, and clearly it is a country, but think of it more as a federation of states. And what we do, we have a president that comes in, and if it's highly regulated from the top, from Washington, it starts stifling the states, it causes problems. But if you take away regulations, if you don't have less input from Washington, you have more control by the states, and more control by the states, it's controlled locally, it's more grounds up. It works. It works every time. And that's exactly what we're seeing.
So it's not that there isn't regulation in place, it's just that it's not at a federal level, so that each of the states are able to dictate their own futures and
yes, it's from the ground up. And that's always better. So whenever there is a deep control from Washington, you'll see some problems building up.
So thinking of an example of, so sometimes though the federal laws are in contention with the state laws, and they're almost ignored, right? So is it making that much of an impact on like the states at all, or is it?
No, it's huge.
Okay.
Yeah. It's been having a significant impact, positive impact. So a classic case is, I always think about the rules and regulations that have come up from high and above, right? So remember the Kyoto agreements in terms of reaching emission targets?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And the United States got absolutely slammed for pulling itself out of that. Okay. But I tell you what, the European way of doing this, they agree to everything to look good. That's the political way of doing it. They agree to it. They couldn't care less about hitting the target.
Yep.
Yeah? The United States, that's a little bit naive, says, I don't want to do it. Well, you should have done what France were always intended to do, was just sign it and have no intention of meeting the targets. Well, which country reached the targets ahead of all the others?
United States?
United
You're
States.
kidding.
I'm not kidding you. Do you know why?
Because they didn't commit to it?
No, because of the fracking industry released much more natural gas into the market.
Yeah.
Natural gas was now driving large amounts of the production of electricity, and the emission levels went far beyond Kyoto.
Wow.
That's the difference between top down versus bottom up.
So is that an argument for is that applicable to trickle down economics? Is that the same?
Yeah, you
all?
could argue. Trickle down has never been an economic model that ever worked. It's one of those memes that just stucks and refuses, a zombie that refuses to die. Yeah, there's never been a real political case for that. No economic case for trickle down. Yeah, so that's interesting.
So despite all that, what could they be doing better?
Well, one of the areas that I was super excited for when Trump was voted in was he campaigned on a infrastructure spend. And the Democrats would not get in the way of that. In fact, it's very likely they would support it. Now, an infrastructure spend in the United States, which desperately needs an infrastructure spend, is the nearest thing to a free lunch as possible. So back to our example that I was talking about of money flowing into the United States. Spending on infrastructure will not create the deficit, but it will absorb the money coming in and place it instead of into consumption, excessive consumption, or low savings, and place it into investment at historically low rates. And it's the closest thing I could think of as a free lunch. Because when you've got antiquated infrastructure, when you spend, every dollar you spend will be productive. And that's what the world needs, is a significant amount of productive investment. So if I can think about what the thing that's causing the global economy so much pain is a lack of demand. And the lack of demand is being felt by, it's been ameliorated to some degree by massive debt. Right, so if you don't have money in your account to create demand, you do it by creating debt. But another way to create demand is productive investment. So another way to absorb excess global savings is to have significant productive investment, and that is as close to a free lunch as I could think. And that would win. The global economy would massively win.
Just from the United States?
Just from the United States. Infrastructure spending. We should all be rooting for that.
How does that impact on a global scale?
Well, you see, because the global economy is massively imbalanced, we got surplus countries that are ridiculously surplus. That means the rest of the world has to be in deficit. Deficit causes an imbalance between investments and savings. If one of those said countries, which is the US, takes the challenge and starts putting that money to proper productive use instead of consumption, that'd be fantastic shape. So the global economy in on itself will rebalance to a degree, not significantly, but to a degree.
It's good to know that we're in good hands with Trump, at least in some respect. It's actually very exciting. Perhaps maybe not from the Australian perspective. Is it actually going to impact Australia in a positive way?
Yeah, so we should do another episode on this. It doesn't mean I think it's a great thing to go into a trade war, and that all of these things are going to impact Australia. But a lot of a lot of these economic consequences that are coming down the pipeline for Australia have been inbuilt into the structure of our economy and how it interrelates with the rest of the globe. And that is changing rapidly. The global economy is rapidly changing, and I'm not sure people are prepared for what's going to happen. Well, I'm sure people are not prepared. Particularly Australia, we're not structured for it, for the next change. And it's coming fast.
Right, so that's something to worry about, but perhaps something we can possibly become prepared for.
Yeah, you can.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Paul. I feel much the wiser.
Thanks, Tim.
This is Currency Affairs.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.